In the unforgiving West, some men hunt for gold, others for glory. But the most dangerous men hunt for other men. Before we ride into the tale of the greatest hunter of them all, and the day his world came crashing down, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single step on this trail of vengeance. The name they gave him was Cain Maddox, but in the saloons and marshal's offices from the dusty plains of Kansas to the sun-scorched mesas of the Arizona Territory, he was known by another name, the Ledger. They called him this for a simple reason: Cain Maddox always closed his accounts. He was a bounty hunter, and in his world, men were little more than figures in a book, bits and credits. He was the final entry, the line drawn, the balance paid in blood and lead. He did not ride alone. A legend like the Ledger attracted talent, or at least effective tools. His crew was a small, brutally efficient machine. There was Deacon Vance, his second in command, a man with a politician's smile and a gunfighter's eyes. Where Cain was silence and strategy, Deacon was charm and smooth talk. He was the velvet glove on Cain's iron fist. Then came Sawtooth Jed, a mountain of a man who spoke in grunts and whose solution to most problems was the application of overwhelming force. He could break a man's spine over his knee as easily as another man might snap a twig. Rounding them out was Reno Jones, the tracker. A weary, nervous man with eyes that missed nothing, Reno could follow a trail across bare rock and could smell a dust storm to days before it hit. His loyalty was as thin as a whisper, but his skills were undeniable. Together, they were the most successful bounty hunters in the territory. They took on jobs no one else would touch, hunting the specters and devils that haunted the frontier. And today, they were closing an account. Their quarry was a man named Elias Thorne, better known as the Clay County Cannibal, a name earned not through actual cannibalism, but through a particularly gruesome habit of mutilating his victims. He was wanted for robbery, the murder of a sheriff, and a list of other sins long enough to fill a preacher's sermon. The bounty was $2,000 in gold coin, a handsome sum. They had tracked him for 3 weeks, across badlands that would bake the soul out of a lesser man, and had finally cornered him in a derelict line shack clinging to the side of a windswept butte. The wind howled, a mournful, lonely sound that peeled paint from the shack's weathered boards. "He's in there," Reno whispered, his body pressed flat against a rock outcropping 50 yards from the shack. "Saw him through the window. He's alone." Cain lay beside him, motionless, studying the shack through his spyglass. He wasn't looking at the man, he was looking at the structure. The rotted porch, the single door, the 2 windows thick with grime. He noted the angle of the sun and the direction of the wind. Every hunt was a problem of geometry and physics. "Deacon," Cain said, his voice low and calm, never rising above the wind. "You're on the west window." "Reno, the east." "Sawtooth, with me. I don't want him running out the back and trying for the rocks. We go in 5 minutes. On my signal." The men dispersed without a word, moving with the fluid silence of predators. This was their craft. Cain trusted Deacon to handle his side, Reno to watch his corner, and Sawtooth to provide the force. The trust was the grease that made the machine run. Cain and Sawtooth crept toward the front of the shack. Cain pulled one of his matched Colt peacemakers, the blued steel dull in the flat afternoon light. He gave a sharp, piercing whistled signal. From the west side of the shack, Deacon's voice rang out, smooth and reasonable. "Elias Thorne, this is Deacon Vance, acting on a warrant from Judge Parker. We have you surrounded. Come on out with your hands empty, and I give you my word you'll make it to the gallows in one piece." It was the standard offer, the illusion of a choice. A single gunshot from inside the shack was Thorne's answer. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Cain's head. "Sawtooth," Cain said calmly. Sawtooth Jed grinned, a terrifying sight. He took a running start and hit the flimsy door with his shoulder. The sound was like a thunderclap. Wood exploded inward, and Sawtooth stumbled into the room, a massive, unstoppable force. 2 more shots boomed from within. One whizzed past Sawtooth's head. The other slammed into his thick leather vest, staggering him but not penetrating. Cain was through the door a second after him, his Colt tracking. Thorne was in the far corner, a wild-eyed man with matted hair, trying to cock his pistol for another shot. But it was over. A shot from Reno's rifle shattered the window. Thorne was standing near, showering him with glass and making him flinch. In that split second of hesitation, Cain fired. His shot was not aimed at the chest or the head. It was a professional's shot, an artist's shot. The bullet struck Thorne's gun hand, shattering the bone. The pistol clattered to the floor. Thorne screamed, clutching his ruined hand. The fight was done. The whole violent encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds. Sawtooth grabbed the wounded outlaw, lifting him like a child and binding his hands. Deacon entered through the door, his own pistol smoking. He'd fired a covering shot through the window. "Nice and clean," Deacon said, holstering his weapon and flashing a smile. "Textbook, even. He won't be winning any card games, but he'll live to hang." Kane didn't answer. He was already retrieving the spent cartridge from his Colt, replacing it with a fresh one. He was a professional. The job was done. The account was ready to be closed. 2 days later, they rode into the town of Redemption, a fitting name for the place their business so often concluded. They marched a bandaged and sullen Elias Thorne into the marshal's office. Marshal Thompson, a man whose face was a permanent roadmap of worry, looked up from his desk. "Maddox," he grunted, a note of weary respect in his voice. "I see you brought the mail." "He's all yours, Marshal," Kane said, pushing Thorne forward. 2,000 in gold, as promised. The Marshal sighed, unlocked a heavy safe, and began counting out stacks of double eagles. The clink of the coins was the only sound in the room. Kane accepted the heavy leather pouches without a word. He signed the ledger on the Marshal's desk, the official record of the capture, and turned to leave. That night, they took a room at the finest hotel in Redemption, which was to say it had a roof that only leaked into places. Kane laid out the 4 canvas bags on the table. He took the $2,000 in gold and meticulously divided it. 800 for himself, as was his due as leader. 400 each for Deacon, Sawtooth, and Reno. It was the standard split. It was fair. It was the law by which they operated. Deacon picked up his bag, weighing it in his hand with a satisfied smile. "Another one for the books. You know, Kane, at this rate, we'll be able to buy our own damn county in a few years." "I'm not in this to buy a county," Kane said, his voice flat. He was cleaning his Colts, a ritual he performed after every job. "This is a business. It's the only business that matters," Sawtooth grunted, already pocketing his share and eyeing the door to the saloon. Reno, ever nervous, quickly hid his gold in a money belt. This was a good one. Easy. I like the easy ones. Later, as Sawtooth and Reno had gone to indulge their respective vices, Kane and Deacon sat at a quiet table in the saloon, a bottle of whiskey between them. "You're a marvel, Kane," Deacon said, pouring them both a drink. "I've ridden with a dozen men, and none of them have your head for this work. You don't get angry, you don't get greedy, you don't get scared. It's all just numbers to you. It's what keeps us alive," Kane said, taking a small sip of the whiskey. "Feelings get you killed. Greed gets you betrayed. Fear gets you shot in the back. We do the job, we collect the fee, we move on. That's the code." "The code," Deacon repeated, a strange look in his eyes as he stared into his glass. "It's a good code, a profitable one. But sometimes, I wonder, is there a number high enough to make you break it?" Kane looked at his right-hand man, the closest thing he had to a friend in the world. He saw the easy smile, the confident eyes, and for a fleeting moment, something else, a flicker of a shadow deep within. He dismissed it. It was the whiskey. It was the weariness of the trail. "There is no such number," Kane said, his voice firm, a statement of unwavering fact. "The ledger has to balance. Always." He believed it. He had built his life, his very identity, on that single, unshakable principle. He had no way of knowing that a man was riding toward redemption at that very moment, a man with a warrant in his saddlebags that carried a number so large, so impossibly vast, that it would not just break the code, it would shatter their world and set Kane Maddox on a path to a hell he could never have imagined. Redemption was a town that lived up to its name. It offered a man a chance to wash away his sins, either with soap and water at the bathhouse or with whiskey at the saloon. For Kane's crew, it was always the latter. The gold from Thorne's bounty was a heavy, comforting weight in their pockets, a tangible reward for their violent brand of bookkeeping. But the comfort was destined to be short-lived. On their second day in town, a new presence arrived. He wasn't a dusty cowboy or a hopeful prospector. This man rode a tired but well-groomed horse, and he wore the dark, unassuming suit of a government man. He was U.S. Marshal Jacob Miles, and he carried a weight far heavier than gold in his saddlebags, a federal warrant. Miles didn't seek out the local law. He went straight to the hotel where he knew Cain Maddox was staying. He found the four of them at a table in the lobby, Cain methodically cleaning his pistols, Deacon reading a day-old newspaper, and the other two playing a listless game of cards. Cain Maddox, the marshal asked, his voice calm and steady. He was a man past his prime, with eyes that had seen too much and a face etched with the weariness of the law. Cain looked up, his hands never ceasing their rhythmic polishing of a pistol cylinder. "Who's asking?" "U.S. Marshal Jacob Miles. I'm riding circuit from Fort Smith. I'm not here for you, Maddox. I'm here to hire you." This drew the attention of the whole table. Deacon folded his newspaper. "Marshal, we appreciate the thought, but we just came off a long trail. The boys are enjoying some well-earned rest." Miles ignored him, his eyes fixed on Cain. "This isn't a request. It's a matter of territorial security. The job is Armando Vargas." A sudden chill seemed to fall over the room. "El Martillo," Reno whispered, his customary nervousness sharpening to a fine point. "The hammer." Even Sawtooth stopped shuffling his cards. Vargas wasn't just an outlaw, he was a force of nature. He ran a small army of smugglers, killers, and thieves that controlled the flow of everything illegal: guns, whiskey, information across a 100-mile stretch of the border. He was ruthless, intelligent, and famously elusive. More than a dozen lawmen and bounty hunters had tried to bring him in. None had come back. "Vargas is a ghost," Cain said flatly, inserting the cylinder back into his Colt with a decisive click. "No one knows his face. No one knows his base of operations. He's not a bounty, he's a suicide mission." "Not anymore," Marshal Miles said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a fresh, crisp warrant, laying it on the table. "One of his lieutenants was captured last month. Before he was killed trying to escape," he talked. "We now know Vargas is operating out of the San Diablo Mountains, and the president has authorized a federal bounty. Unprecedented." He tapped a finger on the bottom of the poster. The number there seemed to mock every bounty they had ever collected. $10,000. The amount was staggering, obscene. It was enough to buy a sprawling ranch, a hotel, a life of complete and utter ease. It was the kind of money that made men dream, and the kind of money that made them kill their friends. Avarice was a tangible thing. It filled the air, thick and suffocating. Sawtooth stared at the number, his mouth slightly agape. Reno was visibly sweating, his eyes darting back and forth from the poster to Cain's face. Deacon let out a low whistle, picking up the warrant. His eyes, however, weren't just on the number. They were on Cain, gauging his reaction. "That's a king's ransom, Marshal," Deacon said, his voice smooth as silk. "It's the devil's ransom," Cain corrected, his voice cold. "A bounty that high isn't a fee. It's bait. It'll draw every cheap gunman and back shooter from here to the Mississippi. And it'll turn partners against each other. Gold fever is a disease, Marshal, and that paper is a plague. We're not interested." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. But Deacon remained seated. "Hold on, Cain," Deacon said, his voice retaining its easy charm, but with a new, harder edge. "Let's not be hasty. Think about it. $10,000. This isn't just another job. This is the job. The last one." He stood and turned to the others. "Think of it, boys. We bring in Vargas, we cash this ticket, and we're done. No more sleeping in the dirt. No more getting shot at for a few $100s. Sawtooth, you could buy that saloon you're always talking about. Reno, you could gamble in San Francisco with the high rollers. We could all walk away." His words were a siren song, perfectly pitched to each man's desires. "He's right, Cain," Sawtooth grunted, his gaze fixed on the poster. "For that much, I'd walk through hell wearing gasoline breeches." Cain looked at his men. He saw the gleam in their eyes, the subtle shift in their posture. He saw the disease of greed beginning to take hold, and it chilled him to the bone. He had always been the unquestioned leader, his judgment absolute. But for the first time, he felt a current of resistance, a tide of ambition pulling against him. "Vargas has an army," Cain stated, trying to inject a dose of reality into their gold-fueled fantasies. "We are for men." "We're not just for men," Deacon countered, stepping closer. "We're the best. We have you. Think of the reputation, Cain. the man who brought in El Martillo. Your name wouldn't just be known. It would be immortal. This is our legacy. The final page of your ledger. What a way to close the book. The appeal to his pride, to his legend, was a masterstroke. Deacon knew him better than anyone. He knew that beneath the cold, professional exterior was a man who took pride in his work, in his name. Marshal Miles, seeing his moment, added the final weight to the scale. The warrant is exclusive to your outfit for 1 month, Maddox. I'm authorized to give you that. No competition. The trail is fresh. This is the best chance anyone will ever have. After that, it goes public. The choice is yours. Kane looked from the marshal's weary face to the eager, hungry eyes of his crew. He looked at Deacon, his most trusted partner, who was smiling that confident, persuasive smile. He felt a profound sense of unease, a cold knot in his stomach that told him this was a mistake. His code was built on managing risk, on taking jobs where the outcome could be controlled. This was a throw of the dice, a gamble for the highest stakes imaginable. But he was outmaneuvered. To refuse now would be to show weakness, to breed a resentment that would fester and rot the crew from within. He was trapped by his own reputation, a prisoner of the legend he had so carefully built. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. We'll take the job. A wave of relief and excitement washed over his men. Deacon clapped him on the shoulder. You won't regret this, Kane. We'll be legends. As Marshal Miles left, satisfied, and the others began to celebrate, Kane Maddox stood by the window, looking out at the dusty street. He didn't feel like a legend. He felt like a man who had just made a deal with the devil, and had willingly led his men down into the fire. The scent of gold was in the air, and with it, the unmistakable stench of damnation. The trail into the San Diablo Mountains was a descent into a harsher, more primal world. The landscape was brutal, a jagged, sun-bleached expanse of rock and cactus where everything from the plants to the reptiles seemed to have thorns or fangs. It was a fitting kingdom for a man like El Martillo. For the first week, the hunt proceeded as it always had. Kane was the brain, the central processing unit of the machine. He dictated the pace, read the signs, and orchestrated their movements with the cold precision of a master chess player. Reno, his senses sharpened by the immense reward, was a preternatural tracker, finding traces of Vargas's large party where a normal man would see only undisturbed wilderness. Sawtooth was the muscle, clearing rockfalls and handling the pack mules with stoic resolve. And Deacon was the voice, the constant wellspring of morale, keeping spirits high with stories of what they would do with their fortunes. But as they pushed deeper, Kane began to feel a subtle dissonance, a series of discordant notes in the familiar rhythm of the hunt. It started with Reno. It's too easy, the weary tracker muttered one evening as they made a cold camp in the shadow of a towering rock spire. Kane looked up from the map he was studying. What do you mean? The trail, Reno said, gesturing nervously into the gloom. They're a big party, maybe 30 men. They're not trying to hide their tracks. They're leaving a highway for us. It feels wrong. Vargas is supposed to be a ghost. Maybe the lieutenant who talked gave away more than we think, Deacon offered, joining them by the firelight. Maybe they're running scared, moving too fast to be careful. It was a plausible explanation, but it didn't sit right with Kane. Arrogance could make a man careless, but Vargas's reputation was built on paranoia and meticulous planning. A few days later, another wrong note. They were navigating a series of winding, narrow canyons. Kane's instinct was to stay high on the ridges, where they would have the advantage of sight and high ground. It was slower, but safer. The canyon floor is faster, Kane, Deacon argued, pointing to the map. We can make up a full day's ride. The trail is clear. If we're going to catch them, we need to close the distance. His logic was sound, on the surface. But it put them in a vulnerable position, with high walls on either side, a perfect landscape for an ambush. Reluctantly, Kane agreed, but the feeling of unease grew, a cold coiling in his gut. He spent the entire day with his hand never far from his Colt, his eyes scanning the canyon rims, but nothing happened. The feeling, however, remained. The moment that transformed his vague suspicion into a sharp, pointed fear came late one night. The camp was quiet, the only sounds the crackle of a low fire and the soft breathing of sleeping men. Kane was a light sleeper, a habit born of 1,000 nights on the trail. A faint sound scuff of a boot on gravel brought him instantly awake. He lay perfectly still in his bedroll, his eyes slitted open. In the faint moonlight, he saw a figure detach itself from the camp and walk toward a distant cluster of boulders. Deacon. Cain watched as another figure, who had clearly been waiting, emerged from the shadows to meet him. They were too far away to be seen clearly or for their words to be heard, but Cain could see the silhouette of their hushed, urgent conversation. It lasted no more than a minute. A small object was passed to Deacon, and the stranger melted back into the night. Deacon returned to the camp, moving silently, and slipped back into his bedroll. The next morning, Cain confronted him. He did it quietly, away from the others, as they were packing the mules. "Who were you talking to last night, Deacon?" Deacon didn't even blink. He cinched a strap on a pack mule and gave Cain a casual smile. "Couldn't sleep. Went for a walk. Ran into a prospector. Poor old devil. Been out here for months chasing a ghost of a gold seam. We shared a bit of tobacco, and he went on his way." The lie was flawless. It was smooth, detailed, and utterly believable. But Cain had seen the urgency in their posture, the furtive way they had met. It hadn't been a chance encounter. It had been a rendezvous. "Did you get his name?" Cain asked, his eyes locked on Deacon's. "Elias, maybe." "Didn't really catch it," Deacon said with a shrug. "Why all the questions, Cain? You're getting jumpy in your old age." He clapped Cain on the shoulder, a familiar gesture of camaraderie that now felt cold and calculated. Cain said nothing more, but the trust, the absolute, foundational trust he had placed in Deacon for years, was gone. It had evaporated in the cold desert night, leaving behind a terrifying vacuum. He was in the wilderness, surrounded by enemies, and now, he was no longer sure who they were. He looked at his crew, at Sawtooth, who had become even more withdrawn, his silence now feeling heavy and watchful. At Reno, whose nervousness had reached a fever pitch, his eyes constantly darting to Deacon, as if for reassurance. And at Deacon himself, his friend, his partner, who now wore his smile like a mask. The machine was broken. The grease of trust had been replaced by the grit of suspicion. And yet, he had no proof. Just a gut feeling, a series of wrong notes that were building into a funeral dirge. He knew he should call it off, turn them back. But the scent of gold was too strong. His men would call it paranoia, a failure of nerve. They would never follow him back. He was trapped, forced to ride forward into a future that his every instinct told him was an ambush. The trail, as laid out by Reno and guided by Deacon, led them toward a jagged scar in the earth, a massive box canyon known on the old maps by a single, ominous name, Devil's Throat. Devil's Throat was aptly named. It was a geological dead end, a massive fissure in the earth with sheer, crumbling rock walls that rose hundreds of feet on three sides. The entrance was a narrow gap, barely wide enough for two horses to ride abreast. It was the perfect trap. "There and there," Reno said, his voice a strained whisper as he peered through his spyglass from a ridge overlooking the entrance. "The trail ends here. Nowhere else for them to go. They're holed up at the back of the canyon." Cain surveyed the scene, and a cold dread washed over him. Every instinct, every lesson learned over a decade of hunting men, screamed at him. "No," he said, his voice flat. "Vargas would never box himself in like this. It's a kill zone. It's desperation, Cain," Deacon argued, his tone smooth and reassuring. "We've pushed him too hard. He's run out of land. This is his last stand. We go in hard and fast, hit them before they can organize a defense, and it's over. He wants us in that canyon," Cain insisted, his eyes scanning the high rims, seeing a dozen perfect places for riflemen to hide. "We stay here. We wait them out." "Wait for what?" Sawtooth grunted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "For them to slip out some back way we don't know about. The gold's in that canyon, Cain. I can smell it. I ain't waiting." A mutiny. It wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air, thick and poisonous. For the first time, Cain's authority had been challenged, his judgment questioned. He looked at the faces of his men, Sawtooth's brutish impatience, Reno's twitchy greed, and Deacon's calm and wavering certainty. He was alone. "This is a mistake," Cain said, his voice low. But he knew it was no use. The gold fever had them. To refuse to go in now would be the end of his crew, and might well get him a bullet in the back. He made a fatal calculation. It was better to ride into a trap with men he thought he could trust than to stand alone against them. "All right," he said, the word tasting like ash. We go in. But we go in smart. Reno, stay here on the ridge. Give us cover fire if things go bad. Sawtooth, Deacon, with me. We ride in slow, use the rocks for cover. As he swung into his saddle, Deacon rode up beside him. It'll be all right, Kane, he said, giving his familiar, confident smile. One last ride. Think of the stories they'll tell. Kane just nodded, his hand resting on his colt. He, Deacon, and Sawtooth urged their horses through the narrow entrance and into the canyon. The silence was unnerving. The air was still and hot. The only sound was the clatter of their horses' hooves on the loose rock. The canyon floor was a maze of boulders and scrub brush. There was no sign of Vargas or his men. I don't like this, Kane said, his voice a low whisper. Just a little further, Deacon urged. They'll be at the very back. They reached the center of the canyon, a wide, open area with very little cover. And then, the world exploded. The first shot was a high-powered rifle cracked from the rim above. A puff of dust kicked up inches from Kane's horse. Then another, and another. A hailstorm of lead rained down on them from a dozen hidden positions. It was the ambush Kane had predicted, perfect in its execution. Split up. Find cover, Kane yelled, his training taking over. He spurred his horse toward a large boulder, bullets whizzing past his ears. He made it to the rock, leaping from his saddle and drawing both Colts. He peered around the edge, expecting to see Sawtooth and Deacon doing the same. What he saw stopped his heart. Sawtooth was not seeking cover. He was sitting calmly on his horse, his pistol still holstered. Deacon was beside him, a cold, placid look on his face, his own gun also untouched. They weren't being fired upon. The gunfire from the rim was focused entirely on him. The horrifying truth crashed down on Kane with the force of a physical blow. The easy trail. The push to enter the canyon. The rendezvous in the night. It had all been a lie. He wasn't the hunter. He was the bounty. He turned, his eyes wide with disbelief, and looked at the man he had called his friend. Deacon, he asked, the name a ragged whisper. Deacon raised his pistol, its dark eye aimed directly at Kane's chest. The friendly smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, transactional finality. From the canyon rim above, a man stood up from behind a rock, a man with a cruel, scarred face and an air of absolute authority. El Martillo Vargas. He watched the scene below with the detached interest of a man watching a play. It's just business, Kane, Deacon said, his voice devoid of all emotion. The bounty on Vargas is 10,000. The price he offered for you was the same, plus a partnership. Better terms. You understand. It's just closing an account. He twisted Kane's own code and used it as a knife. Kane's reflexes were legendary, but he was reacting to a betrayal so profound it had momentarily paralyzed him. He tried to bring his own gun up, but Deacon was already firing. The bullet slammed into Kane's chest, high on the left side. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer. It threw him backward, the breath knocked from his lungs, his vision blurring. He stumbled, his legs giving way. Behind him, he was dimly aware of a sharp drop-off, the edge of a deep, fast-moving river that cut through the canyon floor. He fell. The last thing he saw as he tumbled backward into the abyss was Deacon's face, impassive, already turning away. He heard another gunshot, a final, deafening roar, and then there was only the shocking cold of the water and the darkness closing in. The ledger, for the first time in his life, had been balanced with his own blood. The current was a merciless thief. It stole the air from Kane's lungs, the warmth from his body, and the consciousness from his mind. The darkness that took him was absolute. He was a dead man, a ghost already on his way to hell, his life's blood turning the river water crimson. But fate, in its infinite and cruel irony, was not finished with him. Miles downstream, where the raging canyon river widened and slowed into a muddy, sluggish artery, his body washed up against a tangle of roots on the riverbank. He lay there, half in and half out of the water, a piece of human driftwood, indistinguishable from the other refuse of the flood. He would have died there, but for the improbable presence of another human being in that desolate stretch of wasteland. His name was Elias, an old, half-mad prospector who had been working a worthless claim on that river for 20 years. He was out checking his snares when his one good eye caught the natural shape of a man's boot. Cursing what he thought was a common corpse, Elias went to roll the body back into the river. But then he heard it, a faint, ragged gasp for air. Driven by some long-dormant flicker of humanity, he dragged the heavy, waterlogged body from the river and up to his hovel, a miserable lean-to built of scavenged wood and animal hides. For a week, Kane Maddox existed in a fever dream, a purgatory of pain and fragmented memories. He saw Deacon's cold eyes, felt the impact of the bullet, tasted the muddy water of the river over and over again. Elias, using the crude knowledge of a man long accustomed to fending for himself, cleaned the wound as best he could. The bullet had passed clean through, missing his heart by a miracle, but shattering his collarbone and tearing through muscle. Elias poured raw whiskey into the wound to cleanse it and packed it with a poultice of river moss and herbs. He fed Kane thin broth and cool water, sitting with him through the feverish nights. He wasn't a savior. He was simply a man staving off the loneliness of the desert for a few more days by keeping another heartbeat going. On the 8th day, the fever broke. Kane woke to the sight of a leathery, one-eyed face peering down at him. His body was a symphony of agony, but his mind was, for the first time, clear. "You're in a heap of trouble, son," the old man rasped, his voice like gravel. "Drank most of my whiskey keeping the rot out of you." Over the next few weeks, as Kane's body slowly, painfully began to knit itself back together, the story of what had happened in Devil's Throat trickled back to them. A supply freighter, who made a monthly trip to trade with Elias, brought the news from the outside world. The freighter's tale was one of heroism. Deacon Vance and his brave men, the story went, had cornered the notorious El Martillo. In the ensuing battle, their leader, Kane Maddox, had revealed his true colors. He had made a secret deal with Vargas, and in the chaos, had tried to kill his own partners to take the Outlaws' gold for himself. But Deacon, ever loyal, had been forced to gun his treacherous leader down. Kane Maddox, the story concluded, had fallen into the river and was presumed dead, his body washed away. Deacon and his men, though grieving, had managed to kill Vargas and scatter his gang, securing the territory. They were heroes. Kane listened to this, his face a mask of cold fury. Deacon hadn't just betrayed him. He had stolen his life, his name, his very history, and replaced it with a twisted, monstrous lie. He had murdered Kane Maddox twice with a bullet, and again with a story. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a month later. Kane was now able to walk, his arm in a sling, his body gaunt but his eyes burning with a cold fire. The freighter brought a new stack of wanted posters to give to Elias, a common practice to keep the hermits of the Badlands informed. And there, on the top of the stack, was a face Kane knew well, his own. Below the stern, familiar drawing were the words, "Wanted, Kane Maddox, $5,000 dead or alive, for treason, murder, and conspiracy with the Vargas gang. Approach with extreme caution. $5,000. Deacon had not only framed him, he had put a price on his ghost. He had turned the entire machinery of the law, the entire greedy, bloodthirsty world of bounty hunting, against him. Any man who saw his face would see not a person, but 5,000 reasons to draw his gun. Elias the prospector looked from the poster to Kane's scarred face. "Well, son," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Looks like you ain't just in a heap of trouble. You're the heap." Kane took the poster, his hand trembling slightly with a rage so deep it felt like an earthquake in his soul. He crumpled it into a ball. He had been a hunter. Deacon had made him the hunted. He looked out at the unforgiving landscape, the same wilderness where he had once been the apex predator. Now, it was his cage, and every man in it was his keeper. His recovery was over. A new hunt was about to begin. But this time, he wasn't hunting for profit or for the law. He was hunting to reclaim his name, and to write the final, bloody page of a ledger that now included the names of every man who had once called him partner. Re-entering the world as a wanted man was like being born into a nightmare. Kane Maddox, the man who had once walked into any town with an air of untouchable authority, was now a specter, forced to the shadows. He left Elias's hovel with a half-healed body, the old prospector's rusty pistol, and a singular, cold purpose. He traded his legendary duster for a common poncho and pulled his hat low, his face a landscape of scars and simmering rage. His first stop was a small, dusty border town called Purgatory, a fitting name for the limbo in which he now existed. He needed supplies, ammunition, and most importantly, information. The town was a haven for men on the run, a place where questions were seldom asked. But even here, the first thing he saw, nailed to the marshal's office door, was his own face, staring back at him with dead eyes. The poster was a constant, mocking reminder of Deacon's ultimate betrayal. He felt the eyes on him as he walked down the street. Every glance felt like a judgment, every whisper a potential threat. The $5,000 price on his head was a palpable aura, a scent of blood in the water that drew sharks of all shapes and sizes. The first shark was a young, ambitious kid, no older than 20, with a new colt on his hip and a desperate hunger for a reputation. Cain had seen his type 100 times before, boys who thought a fast draw was all that separated them from legend. The kid spotted him in the general store as Cain was buying cartridges. The recognition was a subtle flicker in his eyes, a sudden stillness in his posture. Cain felt it instantly. The air grew thick. The storekeeper, sensing trouble, slowly backed away. Cain paid for his goods, his movements calm and deliberate, and turned to leave. The kid stepped in front of him, blocking the door. "You've got his eyes," the kid said, his voice trying for a confident drawl but cracking with nervousness. "The eyes on the poster. Cain Maddox." Cain didn't answer. He just looked at the boy, his gaze flat and cold. He saw the sweat on the kid's brow, the way his hand trembled as it hovered over his gun. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away," Cain said, his voice a low rasp. "There's no profit in this for you. $5,000 says you're wrong," the kid blustered, his fear making him reckless. "Draw?" The kid's hand moved, a frantic, desperate blur. But he was drawing against a ghost. Cain didn't seem to move at all. The old, rusty pistol he'd gotten from Elias was simply in his hand, roaring once. The shot was not to kill. It was the same shot he had given Elias Thorne a lifetime ago. The bullet tore through the kid's gun hand, shattering bone and sending his shiny new Colt spinning into the dust. The kid screamed, staring in horror at his mangled hand, his dreams of glory dissolving into a bloody reality. Cain stepped past him and out into the street. He didn't look back. The encounter, as brief and brutal as it was, had taught him everything he needed to know. There would be no hiding. There would be no peace. His old life was a magnet, and it would keep drawing men like this to him until he was dead, or until he had erased the lie that Deacon had created. He was no longer just a man, he was a test. A walking crucible for every bounty hunter, lawman, and glory seeker in the territory. To them, he was a shortcut to a legend. To him, they were obstacles, faceless and nameless, standing between him and his real targets. He vanished into the Badlands, the ghost in a world that was hunting him. He moved by night, resting in caves and forgotten places during the day. He became leaner, harder, more animal than man. The constant pain in his shoulder was a reminder of his betrayal, a burning coal that fueled his rage. He learned that Deacon, hailed as a hero, had used his newfound fame and Vargas's blood money to establish a security firm in the boomtown of Prosperity. He was the law now, bought and paid for. Sawtooth was his enforcer, and Reno, presumably, was his eyes and ears. They had taken Cain's methods, his reputation, and his life, and built a corrupt empire upon his grave. Cain knew he couldn't strike at Deacon directly. Not yet. Deacon would be insulated, surrounded by hired guns. To get to the king, he first had to take the other pieces off the board. He had to unravel the web, thread by thread. He had to start with the weakest link. Reno, the nervous, twitchy tracker whose survival instincts were stronger than any bond of loyalty. Cain knew Reno better than the man knew himself. He knew his habits, his fears, and his vices. And he knew that of all the betrayers, Reno would be the one whose conscience, or more accurately his cowardice, would be the easiest to exploit. Cain turned his horse, not towards the glittering corruption of Prosperity, but towards the dusty, forgotten gambling dens where a man like Reno Jones would inevitably go to spend his blood money and try to outrun his ghosts. The hunt had begun again, but this time, the ledger was his own, and the only currency he was dealing in was fear. Fear was Reno's native language, and Cain Maddox was about to become its most eloquent speaker. He knew that a direct confrontation with the tracker would be difficult. Reno's skills lay in seeing trouble coming and running from it. To catch a creature like that, you didn't set a snare. You built a cage of terror around it until it trapped itself. Kane began his campaign in a dusty, wind-blown town where Reno was known to favor the poker tables. He didn't show his face. He became a whisper. He started by leaving a Cigna-specific type of knot he used to tie off his bedroll, left on the hitching post where Reno's horse was tied. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone else, but to Reno, it would be like finding a rattlesnake in his blankets. That night, as Reno counted his winnings, he found something tucked into the stack of bills, a single, bent cartridge from a .45 Colt, Kane's preferred weapon. There was no note, no threat, just the cold, brassy promise of a debt to be paid. Reno left town the next morning, his horse at a full gallop. He was running. It was exactly what Kane wanted. For 2 weeks, Kane herded him. He never showed himself, but his presence was everywhere. Reno would find the stripped feathers of a raven Kane's trail marker laid across his path. He would wake in the night to the sound of a lone, piercing whistle, the same signal Kane had used to start the ambush at Thorn's shack. He was being haunted, and his nerve, already frayed, began to shred. He fled to a ghost town called Dust Devil Creek, a collection of sun-bleached skeletons of buildings in the middle of a vast salt flat. He thought he could lose himself there, but he was only isolating himself further. As a massive dust storm, a haboob, began to gather on the horizon, Kane knew it was time. He found Reno cowering in the ruins of the old saloon as the wind began to howl, picking up sand and grit that stung the skin. Kane didn't enter through the swinging doors. He came through a back window, as silent as the dust that was beginning to seep through the walls. Reno was a wreck. His eyes were wild, his face was pale, and he held a whiskey bottle in one hand and a shaking pistol in the other. "I knew it," Reno shrieked as Kane stepped out of the shadows. "I knew you weren't dead. You're the devil himself. The devil is who you made your deal with, Reno," Kane said, his voice a low growl, seeming to come from the storm itself. "I'm just the bill collector." "It was Deacon," Reno confessed, the words spilling out of him in a desperate, pathetic torrent. "It was always Deacon. He planned the whole thing. He met with Vargas's men. He set the path. He made the deal. He said you were getting old, cautious. Said your code was holding us back from real money. And you went along with it," Kane stated, taking a slow step forward. "He gave me no choice," Reno cried. "It was him or you. He had the numbers. And the gold. I just wanted my share. I never wanted you dead, I swear it." Kane stopped, just out of arm's reach. The wind howled outside, rattling the building's frame. "Where are they?" "Deacon's in Prosperity. He runs the town now. He's got a dozen men on his payroll. And Sawtooth. Sawtooth is his marshal. He's the one who beats the fear into everyone. They're based at the old silver mine, the Lucky Lady. That's their fortress." Reno had given him everything. He was an empty vessel now, drained of information and courage. He lowered his pistol, tears of fear and relief streaming down his dusty cheeks. Are you gonna kill me, Kane?" he whispered. Kane looked at the sniveling, broken man before him. Killing him would be an anticlimax, a mercy he didn't deserve. "No," Kane said, his voice cold and empty. "Deacon is the one who wanted you. He paid for your loyalty. I'm leaving you here, Reno. When this storm passes, you can try and outrun him. Or you can try and outrun me. But from now on, every shadow will look like one of us. Every night, you'll wonder if the sound you hear is the wind or a bullet being chambered. I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to let you live with what you've done." He turned and walked to the door. "Kane, wait," Reno screamed, scrambling after him. "Don't leave me. Take me with you." Kane paused at the doorway, the full force of the storm now visible, a churning wall of brown devouring the world. He looked back at Reno one last time. "You made your choice in the canyon," he said. And with that, he stepped out into the storm and vanished, leaving Reno Jones alone with his gold, his ghosts, and the howling, unforgiving wind. Prosperity was a town built on a lie. From a distance, it gleamed with the promise of its name, a bustling hub of silver and commerce. But up close, the gleam was just the sweat of fear. The town was Deacon Vance's personal fiefdom, and Sawtooth Jed was his iron-fisted law. The badge on Sawtooth's chest was not a symbol of justice, but an emblem of ownership. Kane knew a direct assault was suicide. Sawtooth was a beast of a man, and he was Deacon's beast. To get to him, Kane couldn't use fear, as he had with Reno. Sawtooth's only fear was poverty. Cain had to use something else, strategy. He had to dismantle the town's fear of Sawtooth and turn it into a weapon. He became a rumor, a whisper of vengeance in the night. He started by disrupting Deacon's operations. A payroll wagon would be it, but the money wouldn't be stolen. It would be scattered in the street for the downtrodden miners to find. A shipment of whiskey for Deacon's saloon would be found with all the barrels smashed open, the precious liquid soaking into the dust. These were pinpricks, but they were calculated. They made Deacon look weak and his enforcer look incompetent. More importantly, they planted a seed of hope among the terrorized townsfolk. They began to whisper about a ghost, a specter of justice haunting the edges of their town. They called him the Ledger, the name traveling from the saloons to the mine shafts. Sawtooth grew enraged. He doubled the guards, beat suspects in the street, and made the town an even more miserable place to live, which only further eroded his control. He was a blunt instrument, and Cain was playing him like a fiddle. The final act was set. Cain knew Sawtooth's greatest pride was his own strength, his belief in his own invincibility. Cain sent him a message, delivered by a scared saloon girl, a single bullet, with JD scratched into the lead, left on Sawtooth's desk. It was a direct challenge. Cain was waiting for him at high noon in the town square. He didn't hide. He stood there, out in the open, alone, gaunt figure in a dusty poncho. The townsfolk, sensing the coming climax, scurried for cover, watching from windows and alleyways. Sawtooth emerged from the marshal's office, his face a thundercloud of fury. He was a giant, his shadow stretching long and menacing in the midday sun. "Maddox," he roared, "I'm gonna break every bone in your body and feed you to the hogs." "You were always long on talk, Jed," Cain said, his voice calm, carrying across the silent square. This was not to be a quick draw. It was a battle of wills. Sawtooth charged, foregoing his gun for the pleasure of a physical confrontation. He was a charging bull, and Cain was the matador. Cain didn't try to match his strength. He used his speed and his mind. As Sawtooth swung a fist that could shatter stone, Cain sidestepped, letting the big man's momentum carry him past. Cain moved around him, firing his pistol not at Sawtooth, but at the environment. He shot the supports of a wooden awning, sending it crashing down on the giant. He shot the knot of a rope holding a stack of barrels, sending them tumbling into Sawtooth's path. The fight was a brutal, swirling ballet. Sawtooth was all rage and power, slowly breaking down the square around them. Cain was all precision and control, slowly breaking down the man. Finally, bleeding from a dozen cuts and exhausted, Sawtooth cornered Cain against the blacksmith shop. "No more tricks, ghost," he snarled, lunging forward. Cain stood his ground. At the last second, he dropped, and as Sawtooth lunged over him, Cain fired his last bullet. The shot was aimed not at his chest or head, but at his knee. The sound of the bone shattering was sickeningly loud. Sawtooth screamed, a sound of pure agony, and collapsed, his leg folding beneath him at an unnatural angle. The giant was crippled. Cain walked over to him, reloading his pistol. He knelt beside the groaning, defeated man. "It's over, Jed." Sawtooth looked up, his face a mask of pain and hatred. "He'll see you coming," he gasped. "Deacon, he's not like us, Cain. He's a snake. He's got a back way out of the mine. A tunnel leads to the old monastery on the mountain." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "He'll run. He'll always run." Cain stood up, looking down at the man who had helped destroy his life. He could end it right there, but the people of prosperity were watching. "The debt is paid," Cain said. He turned his back on Sawtooth and walked away, leaving him to the mercy, or the wrath, of the townsfolk who were now slowly emerging from the shadows, their eyes no longer full of fear, but of a dawning, dangerous courage. Sawtooth's information confirmed Cain's suspicions. Deacon was a coward at his core, and he would have an escape route. The old monastery, perched high on Sandiabo Peak like a vulture's nest, was the perfect bothole, fortified, isolated, with a commanding view of any approach. But Cain would not be approaching from the front. As news of Sawtooth's defeat spread, the fragile shell of Deacon's authority shattered. The people of prosperity, emboldened by the fall of their tormentor, rose up. It wasn't an organized army, but a wave of righteous anger. Led by a grim-faced miner whose family had been wronged by Deacon, a mob armed with pickaxes, hunting rifles. And courage born of desperation began the long march up the mountain toward the Lucky Lady mine and the monastery beyond. This was the diversion Cain needed. While Deacon's hired guns prepared for a frontal assault from the enraged townsfolk, Cain made his way to the hidden tunnel Sawtooth had spoken of. It was an old emergency exit from the deepest part of the silver mine, long forgotten by all but its owner. He moved through the dark, suffocating confines of the earth, the only sound the drip of water and the pounding of his own heart. He was a ghost in the machine, an avenger rising from the grave. The tunnel emerged, as Sawtooth had promised, into the cold, stone cellar of the mountaintop monastery. The building was a labyrinth of silent, vaulted hallways and dusty, forgotten chapels. Cain moved through it with the lethal grace of a phantom. He encountered Deacon's last few loyal guards, men who were waiting for a battle at the gates, not an executioner from within. He dispatched them with brutal, silent efficiency, one in a dark confessional, another in the bell tower. He was not a soldier in a battle. He was the ledger, closing accounts. He found El Martillo Vargas in the main sanctuary. The legendary outlaw was not the fearsome demon of the wanted posters. He was a man, packing saddlebags with gold bullion, preparing to flee his own crumbling empire. He looked up as Cain entered, his hand instinctively going for his gun. "Maddox," Vargas said, a flicker of genuine surprise in his hard eyes. "They said you were dead." "Deacon is a liar," Cain said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "He is a useful liar," Vargas corrected, drawing his pistol. "But his usefulness has come to an end." The gunfight was short and profane in the holy space. Bullets ricocheted off stone saints and shattered a stained glass window depicting the Archangel Michael casting Lucifer into hell. Vargas was fast, but Cain was purpose incarnate. A single shot from Cain's Colt struck Vargas in the throat, and the great El Martillo fell, choking on his own blood at the foot of the altar. Cain stepped over the body without a second glance. Vargas had only ever been a name on a warrant, a piece of the puzzle. The true devil was still waiting. He walked through the sanctuary, his boots echoing on the stone floor, and pushed open the heavy oak doors that led to the monastery's central courtyard. Deacon was there. The courtyard was an oasis of dead tranquility in the heart of the chaos. A gnarled, ancient olive tree stood in the center, its leaves rustling in the mountain wind. Deacon Vance was standing beneath it, a packed saddlebag at his feet. He wasn't surprised to see Cain. He looked as if he had been waiting. "I knew you'd come," Deacon said, his voice calm, the charming mask back in place one last time. "You were always so predictable, Cain. So driven by your codes and your ledgers." "This is the last entry, Deacon," Cain said, stopping 20 paces away. The sounds of the townsfolk attacking the main gate were a distant, rhythmic drumbeat to their final confrontation. "Is that what this is about? Your precious code?" Deacon chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I offered you a kingdom, Cain. We could have been gods. But you were content to be a bookkeeper. You were a magnificent tool, but you had no vision. I did what you were never willing to do. I evolved." "You call this evolution?" Cain asked, gesturing to the stolen gold, the dead men. "You betrayed everything we stood for." "We stood for profit." Deacon's voice finally broke, the mask cracking to reveal the raw, seething ambition beneath. "That was the only code that ever mattered. You just wrapped it up in fancy words like honor and law. I just stripped away the hypocrisy. I took what I wanted. It's the only real law there is." He opened his coat, revealing two gleaming, silver-plated pistols tucked into his belt. "I learned from the best, Cain. I know all your tricks, all your methods. There's nothing you can do that I can't anticipate." "You're wrong," Cain said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's one thing you never learned. You never learned what happens when a man has nothing left to lose." The final gunfight was not a flurry of motion. It was a moment of absolute, frozen stillness, followed by a thunderclap. Both men drew, their movements a mirror image of years of shared experience. 2 guns fired, then 2 more. It was over in a heartbeat. Deacon stood frozen for a second, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the 2 dark, spreading stains on his chest. He looked back up at Cain, a question in his eyes. He had been just as fast, just as accurate. How? He didn't see the 3rd stain, low on Cain's side, already soaking his poncho in a dark, steady stream. Cain had taken a bullet meant to be fatal, and in that same instant had fired twice. It was a trade Deacon had never anticipated. A trade only a man with nothing left to lose would make. Deacon crumpled to the ground, his vision, his empire, his entire world of lies turning to dust. He died at the foot of the ancient olive tree, his hand outstretched, trying to grasp the gold that was now forever beyond his reach. Cain stood swaying, his vision blurring. The courtyard doors burst open and the miners, the people of prosperity, poured in. They stopped, seeing the scene before them, Vargas dead in the chapel, Deacon dead in the courtyard, and their ghost, their ledger, standing alone, wounded, over it all. They looked at him with awe and gratitude. They looked at the piles of gold. "It's yours," the lead miner said. "You've earned it. The town is yours." Cain looked at their faces, at the gold, at the bodies of the men who had been his brothers. He had won. He had cleared his name. He had balanced the ledger. But he felt nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. He had hunted his betrayers and become a monster to do so. Without a word, he clutched his side, stumbled to the horse Deacon had prepared for his own escape, and pulled himself into the saddle. He didn't look at the gold. He didn't look at the people. He just looked at the endless, open wilderness stretching out before him. He rode out of the monastery, a wounded, solitary figure. The people watched him go, a legend riding into the sunset. They never saw him again. But in the years that followed, travelers in the deep territory would sometimes tell stories of a quiet, scarred man who would appear from nowhere to help those in need, before vanishing as mysteriously as he came. They said he was a ghost, a myth. But the bounty hunters, the back shooters, and the betrayers, they knew better. They knew that the ledger was still out there, and that some accounts, once opened, could never truly be closed.